Civility and culture. Interesting topic. What is it that really necessitates living by the highest standard possible? It's something that carries with it a concern for others as well as a concern for one's self. In the time we have together, I want to talk about those things that actually separate the best type of a society from those in history that actually go down as the worst. What kind of precepts should be followed? What kind of principles really need to be understood? What kind of laws and rules need to really be established in any culture, that society to actually thrive? For the time we have together on this occasion, and maybe the next as well, I want to go back to the book of Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 18 and 19. Leviticus 18, just for a principle that's involved that will unfold in chapter 19. In the very beginning of Exodus 18, he says in verse 3, God says in verse 3 that I do not want you to follow the lifestyle of the Egyptians. Now, while you were actually incarcerated as a slave nation, you saw a lot of things in Egypt that I really do not want you to follow. That being the case, what is the best way for society to actually thrive? What needs to be present? At the beginning in chapter 19, I want to take a look at the first half of this chapter. I only have time to deal with part of it on this occasion and continue the next time we're together. Verse number 1 of Leviticus 19, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. So if we start thinking about the ethics of society, number one is don't pattern yourself like somebody else just because you don't know any better. Don't follow the Egyptians because that's all that you have known. There are things that were problematic. So what needs to be digested is things that are good and what needs to be thrown away. The very first thing that's mentioned in chapter 19 is the integrity that you need to possess. And it's encapsulated in that statement, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. I want you to live in the best possible way with a concern for those around you and a way to better yourself. There needs to be an integrity about the way that you approach life in general. And then in verse number 3, every one of you shall revere his mother and his father. And then he says also, keep my Sabbaths, for I am the Lord your God. Respect. Respect for others. Respect for those who are endeavoring to guide your life. Respect for those who are endeavoring to teach you the principles that will guide you through the rest of your life. And then in verse number 4, do not turn to idols, nor make for yourselves molten gods, for I am the Lord your God. There is a standard greater than yourself. Don't approach life as though you are smarter than anyone in your generation or anyone in your culture, and you have all of the answers, because you don't. And this kind of insipid thirst for fabricating deities throughout history is something that sets itself upon that greed and that self-absorption where individuals thinking we can actually come up with a story on our own. And there's a futility involved in that kind of engagement. Don't do that. The Egyptians were doing that right and left. They worshipped on almost anything and everything that moved. Don't do that. And don't consider yourself wise enough to figure all of these things out totally on your own. It falls upon the respect for others. It's mentioned there in verse number 3, verse number 4. Recognize there is an authority greater than yourself. Beginning in verse number 5 down through verse number 8. If you offer sacrifice of a peace offering to the Lord, you shall offer it of your own free will. Now he talks about sacrifices, verse 5 down through verse 8, but the idea is loyalty that's not coerced. And carries with it kind of a two-edged sword. Number one, you can't coerce somebody into doing something and expect them to follow suit with that throughout their life. They won't. Any kind of rejection of things that are false need to be based upon somebody's understanding of why they need to reject that, not because somebody makes them do it. The loyalty is something that can't be coerced. It's something that's voluntary and always must be. I need to understand why I'm doing this in the first place. Then verse 9 and verse 10. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not wholly reap the corners of your field. Don't gather the gleanings of your harvest through the corners of those fields. You shall leave those for the poor and the stranger. Verse number 10. There is a benevolent factor that must be involved in the way that you approach life. You need to be aware of those that are less fortunate than are you, and do whatever you can to help them. There's something that needs to be said at this particular point. This is not a handout. It is not the case that I want you to harvest your field, but I want you to harvest all of it, but you need to save a little bit of it back and give it to those people just as a handout. They have a responsibility to get up on their own effort and actually go to the edges of that field and gather that grain for themselves. Effort is something that's involved, even with the idea of that benevolence. Those that are in dire need to see the responsibility of themselves actually being engaged in that effort to attain what they really, really need. It's not a handout, but it's a way that they can actually gather things that cause them to survive on their own. In verse number 13, do not steal, you should not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another. The way that you approach people around you, theft is never something that is appropriate. We're seeing in our culture some states that are beginning to have the idea that, well, those that are unfortunate actually steal from others. If it's something where they're destitute and they need that, they really shouldn't have to pay any kind of a penalty. They shouldn't be brought up on any kind of charge whatsoever. Provide a way that those who are less fortunate can actually gain what they need to survive, but don't allow them to actually steal in the process of doing that. Again, benevolence in society is something that you find really exhibited here among the children of Israel by the dictates of God to Moses, to the people. But stealing from others, never justified. Lying, never justified. Dealing falsely, never justified. Here's that verse again. You shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another. Have a truthfulness about the way that you talk, the way that you live, the way that you approach others. Now the edicts of this particular chapter go all the way down through verse 18. We're only verse number 11. I want to stop at this particular point, lest we belabor a lot of things all in one setting. Civility and culture, living by a higher standard, is not that difficult of a concept to grasp, unless somebody is bent on gaining all the power that they can and being seen as the savior of humanity by providing all sorts of things that people need, by taking away the responsibility of those individuals that are the needy individuals, taking away that responsibility out of their hand and just giving them something for free. You know the old adage, you can feed somebody without teaching them how to feed themselves, and you created somebody that will never be able to exist on their own. I think the cliche is give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. Modern society needs to learn that. The Israelites did. At times they forgot, just like modern humanity has forgotten this and so much more. Civility and culture requires a lot, but it's not that difficult to understand. Interesting book, Leviticus. Interesting chapter, chapter 19. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.